are some mysteries that begin with a body, a corpse that shouldn't be there, a room that has been locked from the inside, a photograph containing something that shouldn't exist. But tonight's mystery begins with something much smaller, a child, sometimes barely old enough to read. A child who wakes from a nightmare and tells their parents they used to be someone else. Not, I dreamed I was somebody else. Not, I want to be a pilot. Not, I saw this on television. They say it as a fact. I was somebody else. And then come the details. Names, places, people they've supposedly never met, houses they've never visited, jobs they couldn't possibly understand. Sometimes they describe the way their previous life ended, a plane falling from the sky, a drowning, a car accident, a murder, and occasionally the story gets even stranger. Because investigators go looking, and they find someone who actually existed, someone who lived in the place the child described, someone who had the job the child described, someone who died in the way the child described. And sometimes there are records, witnesses, photographs, medical evidence, even statements written down before the alleged previous person was identified. That doesn't prove reincarnation, but it creates a problem, because if reincarnation isn't the answer, what exactly are we looking at? Tonight on Stranger Things, we're going to examine several of the strangest documented cases of children who appeared to remember lives they shouldn't have known. A little boy who claimed he had been a World War II fighter pilot. A child who seemed to remember the glamorous world of old Hollywood. Twin girls whose behavior, fears, and physical marks appeared to echo two dead sisters. A Scottish boy who desperately wanted to return to a family on an island he'd never visited. A little girl whose memories led investigators more than 100 miles away to another family. And one of the most unusual patterns discovered by a psychiatrist who spent decades collecting thousands of these cases. Tonight, we're going to follow the evidence, and when the evidence runs out, we'll step into the darkness. Because perhaps the strangest question isn't whether these children remember past lives. Perhaps it's this: what would have to be true about consciousness for them to remember anything at all? I am your host Malachi, and this is Stranger Things. Before we meet our first child, we need to understand why these stories have attracted serious investigation. Reincarnation is ancient. Long before modern paranormal culture, religions and philosophies around the world developed ideas involving consciousness returning in another body. But the modern investigation of alleged past life memories took a very different route. Instead of asking people to undergo hypnosis and describe a supposed previous incarnation, psychiatrist Ian Stevenson concentrated heavily on something much more interesting: children. Specifically, children who spontaneously began talking about another life. That distinction matters. Hypnotic regression can be heavily influenced by suggestion, imagination, and the expectations of the person being hypnotized. Stevenson was interested in cases where a child simply began talking. Often, between the ages of 2 and 5, the child might say things like, "My house was over there. I had another mother. I died. I was a soldier. I had a wife." And then the investigators would try to determine whether any of it corresponded to reality. Stevenson eventually documented thousands of cases. His work became controversial, but it was not simply a collection of ghost stories. Some cases contained written records, some included independent witnesses, some involved medical documentation, and some involved children identifying people or locations before the investigators knew who or what the child was talking about. One especially important category involved what Stevenson called birthmarks and birth defects. In his enormous work, Reincarnation and Biology, Stevenson examined 225 cases involving physical abnormalities that he believed corresponded to injuries or marks on deceased people. A later review of his material noted 75 cases involving the head and neck alone. Imagine a child claiming to have been shot, then imagine a birthmark appearing where the supposed bullet wound had been. Or a child claiming a previous life ended with a severe injury to a particular part of the body, while possessing a congenital abnormality in that same location. There are obvious alternative explanations: coincidence, selective reporting, family influence, memory distortion, cultural expectations. But once enough of these cases accumulate, the question becomes more interesting. Not necessarily, is reincarnation real? But why do these particular stories keep appearing? And that's where our first case begins. In 1998, a boy named James Leininger was born in California. His family eventually moved to Louisiana, and when James was about 2 years old, something strange began happening. He became obsessed with airplanes. At first, that's not unusual. Lots of children love airplanes, but James's fascination quickly became disturbing. He began having nightmares. In them, he was trapped inside a plane. The aircraft was falling. He talked about being shot down. His parents reportedly heard him screaming things like, "Airplane crash," and then came the details. James said he had been a pilot. He said the plane had taken off from a ship. When his father asked which ship, James reportedly answered, "Natoma." That was strange, because USS Natoma Bay was a real American escort carrier used during World War II. James also talked about being shot down by Japanese aircraft. He used terms associated with World War II aircraft, and he eventually supplied another name, Jack Larson. His parents began searching, and what they discovered was disturbing. There really had been a pilot named James M. Houston Jr. who had flown from the Natoma Bay during the Iwo Jima operation. Houston died during the fighting. The match was not perfect, and that's important. The details surrounding Houston's death, Iwo Jima, and nearby Chichijima are complicated, but the basic correspondence between the child's statements and the historical pilot became the foundation of one of the most famous modern American reincarnation cases. The case became famous. It also became controversial. Critics pointed out that James had been exposed to aviation and World War II material. They questioned when various statements were actually made. They questioned how accurately his parents remembered the sequence of events. One major critical analysis argued that ordinary information exposure, parental prompting, and memory reconstruction could potentially explain much of the story. But another researcher, James G. Matlock, later reconstructed a detailed timeline using dated emails and other records, and argued that the chronology supported the Leininger family's account. And that leaves us in an uncomfortable place. The case is neither the airtight proof that some believers claim, nor the effortlessly solved story that some skeptics suggest. It's a disputed case, but even the dispute tells us something important. The moment we start asking whether information was obtained normally, we are no longer dealing with folklore, we're dealing with an evidence problem. And our next case gets even stranger, because this time, the dead man wasn't a famous war hero. He was an obscure Hollywood figure. Ryan Hammons was 4 years old when he began telling his mother something that stopped her cold. He had been somebody else, not just somebody else. A man connected to Hollywood. Ryan talked about movies, Broadway, dancing, travel, actors, and a life that seemed impossibly glamorous compared with the quiet existence of a young boy in Oklahoma. His mother, Cindy, began writing down what he said. That decision would become extremely important, because the memories weren't merely preserved in someone's memory after the fact. She began keeping a journal of his statements before the identity of the alleged previous person was established. Ryan talked about a man who had worked in Hollywood. He described having an agency. He talked about changing people's names. He mentioned a connection with Broadway. He remembered restaurants in Chinatown. He talked about a friend named George. And then came something particularly strange. Ryan's family eventually encountered an old Hollywood photograph. Ryan pointed to a man. The identity wasn't immediately clear. The first attempt to identify the man led investigators down the wrong path. Then a film archivist took another look. The man turned out to be Marty Martyn, and Marty Martyn was a real person. Born Morris Kalinsky in Philadelphia in 1903, Martyn had worked as a tap dancer in New York before moving to Los Angeles, where he became involved in the film industry and eventually ran a talent agency. Now the investigators had a candidate, and Ryan's statements could be compared with an actual biography. Some matched, some did not, and many couldn't be verified. This is where the story gets much more interesting than the internet version. Ryan's mother eventually recorded 230 separate statements. According to the published case analysis, 55 were judged to have been verified, 15 were incorrect or implausible, and 140 remained unverifiable. That means the case is not, Ryan knew everything. He didn't. He was wrong about things. And that's precisely why the case deserves a closer look. He wasn't delivering a perfect biography. He was delivering fragments. Some were wrong, some were unknowable, and some corresponded with the life of a man who had died decades before Ryan was born. There were behavioral elements too. Ryan became fascinated with old movies. He played at being a talent agent. He wanted to dress like one. He developed an interest in tap dancing. He even reportedly displayed an unusual dislike of cats and an affinity for Chinese restaurants. Researchers also conducted picture recognition tests in which Ryan's parents didn't know which photograph was significant. That kind of procedure doesn't eliminate every possible source of bias, but it makes the story considerably more interesting. And there is one detail that I think is particularly haunting. Ryan wasn't simply interested in Marty Martyn. He seemed emotionally attached to the idea that he had lost a life. He worried about what had happened to the people from his other existence. And at one point, he reportedly expressed the idea that although he didn't look like the man in the photograph, he was still that man on the inside. That sentence sounds almost cinematic. But the case isn't a movie. It was investigated, and it contains both intriguing matches and inconvenient misses, which means we can't honestly call it proof, but we also can't simply erase the verified pieces. And now we move to England, because if Ryan's story is strange, the Pollock twins are downright unsettling. The sisters who came back as twins, Hexham, England, May 5th, 1957, two sisters, Joanna Pollock, 11 years old, and Jacqueline Pollock, 6, were killed in a road accident. Their deaths devastated their parents, but something happened the following year. Florence Pollock became pregnant. In October 1958, she gave birth to twin girls, Gillian and Jennifer. John Pollock, the children's father, believed strongly in reincarnation. Florence was much more skeptical, and that difference becomes extremely important when examining the case, because the father already had a theory. He believed his dead daughters had returned, but then the twins began displaying strange characteristics. Jennifer had birthmarks that reportedly corresponded to marks on Jacqueline. One was on her waist, another was on her forehead, corresponding to a scar Jacqueline had received during her life. Then the twins became interested in objects belonging to their dead sisters. They reportedly identified toys associated with Joanna and Jacqueline, and when the family eventually returned to Hexham, the girls reportedly recognized locations associated with their deceased sisters. Then came one of the darkest details: cars. The girls were frightened by them. They reportedly reacted with fear when cars approached, at times crying that the car was coming to get them. The pattern was striking. 2 girls die in a car accident. A year later, twins are born. One possesses marks corresponding to marks on one of the dead children. The twins display behaviors and interests reminiscent of the deceased sisters, and they appear to recognize locations associated with the sisters. Ian Stevenson investigated the case and regarded it as significant. But again, the story isn't as simple as scientist proves reincarnation. The father believed in reincarnation. That creates a major potential source of influence. Children can absorb information without adults realizing it. And the family grieving 2 children could unintentionally reinforce a narrative. Even birthmarks can occur by chance. The case, therefore, remains contested, but it has one feature that makes it especially fascinating. The alleged reincarnation isn't simply a single child claiming to be a dead stranger. It's a family structure. 2 children, 2 deceased sisters, 2 personalities that seemed, according to the reports, to echo the children who had died. And eventually, as the twins grew older, the apparent memories faded. That, too, is consistent with a pattern researchers have repeatedly reported. Young children claiming past life memories often begin around ages 2 to 5, with the memories frequently fading as they grow older, which raises a disturbing possibility. Maybe childhood isn't the time when these memories are invented. Maybe it's the time when something is forgotten. Scotland. A young boy named Cameron Macaulay began talking about a place he'd never visited, the Isle of Barra. Cameron described a white house overlooking the sea. He talked about a family, a father named Shane Robertson. He remembered a black and white dog. He described an environment where airplanes landed on a beach. That last detail sounds almost like a child's imagination. Except Barra actually has an unusual airport, whose runway is located on the beach. Cameron's mother became increasingly concerned. The boy wasn't casually telling stories. He wanted to go home. He repeatedly talked about his other family. His memories caused enough distress that researchers became involved. Jim Tucker, who had taken over much of the University of Virginia's work on spontaneous past life memories after Ian Stevenson, investigated Cameron's case. Eventually, Cameron and his family traveled to Barra, and some of Cameron's descriptions corresponded with the island. The house existed. The geography made sense. The surname Robertson appeared in connection with the area, but here is the important wrinkle. The investigators could not locate the exact man Cameron described as his previous father. So once again, the mystery refuses to cooperate. Some pieces fit, some don't. Cameron's case is therefore fascinating precisely because it doesn't provide us with a clean supernatural package. The location existed. The environmental details were unusually specific, but the identity of the previous personality remained uncertain, and perhaps that is more realistic. If reincarnation exists, we shouldn't expect every case to come with a neat certificate of authenticity. But if reincarnation doesn't exist, we still have to explain why a young child would describe a real and unusual location he'd apparently never experienced. Memory is strange. Children are strange. Human perception is strange. And sometimes those 3 things combine into stories that seem to sit just beyond the reach of an ordinary explanation. But now we're going to look at a case with something particularly powerful. A record made before the investigation knew where the story was going. India. A little girl named Swarnlata Mishra began speaking about another life when she was around 3 years old. She described a family, a home, people she claimed to know, and eventually she provided enough information for an investigator, H.N. Banerjee, to locate the family she appeared to be describing. This is one of the details that makes the case particularly important. The information existed before the alleged previous identity was established. In other words, the investigators weren't simply finding a dead person and then asking, "How many things can we make fit?" Some of Swarnlata's statements had already been recorded. Banerjee followed the information, and he located the family. Ian Stevenson later investigated the case himself. He interviewed Swarnlata's family and members of the family she claimed to have belonged to. He also obtained earlier investigation notes and correspondence. Swarnlata reportedly described the previous family's house, a white house, 4 stuccoed rooms, black doors with iron bars, stone flooring, a family that owned a car, which was relatively unusual in the area at the time. But the most interesting part wasn't the architecture, it was recognition. When she encountered members of the other family, she reportedly recognized them. According to accounts of the investigation, she displayed knowledge of personal details associated with the family, and she continued to remember the previous life for far longer than many of Stevenson's other cases. By adulthood, she reportedly still maintained that she remembered the previous existence. This case has another feature that makes it unusually valuable for our purposes. It wasn't simply a story told decades later. There were multiple investigations. There were records from different investigators. Stevenson returned to the case, and some of the earliest information could be compared against what investigators later found. That doesn't prove reincarnation, but it reduces one obvious problem: repifitting, the temptation to reshape a story after discovering the answer. And that brings us to one of the biggest questions in this entire field. What would actually count as evidence? Imagine a child is born with an unusual mark. Nothing paranormal about that. Millions of people have birthmarks. Now imagine that child begins talking about a previous life. The child claims to have died from a gunshot, and the birthmark happens to be located where the bullet supposedly entered. Still a coincidence? Maybe. Now imagine investigators find medical records or photographs documenting the deceased person's wound, and the location corresponds. Now we're interested. This was one of the areas Ian Stevenson spent decades investigating. His massive work, Reincarnation and Biology, examined cases where congenital marks or defects were said to correspond with wounds or other physical characteristics of deceased individuals. The 2024 review of Stevenson's work noted that he documented 225 cases involving birthmarks and birth defects in the larger study, including 75 cases involving the head and neck. The cases included everything from scars, allegedly corresponding to fatal wounds, to congenital abnormalities that appeared to echo injuries. Stevenson did not claim that every birthmark was paranormal. Instead, he argued that some of the correlations were difficult to dismiss as ordinary coincidence. And here's where the story becomes philosophical, because there are at least 4 possible explanations. 1. Reincarnation is real. 2. Some unknown form of information transfer exists between people. 3. The cases are being distorted by memory, suggestion, cultural expectations, and selective reporting. 4. We're looking at coincidences whose improbability feels greater than it actually is because we remember the spectacular matches and forget the millions of non-matches. That 4th possibility is especially important. Imagine 10 million children are born. One of them eventually develops a story that happens to correspond with an unusual deceased person. We would probably call it extraordinary, but we wouldn't necessarily ask how many millions of children had ordinary birthmarks and no strange story. This is the statistical shadow behind paranormal research. But there is another problem. Some of these cases contain information that appears before the investigators identify the deceased person, and that is harder to dismiss with simple hindsight. It doesn't make reincarnation inevitable, but it keeps the question alive. And now we're going to step back from the individual cases, because the most fascinating thing may not be any single child. It may be the pattern. Across decades of research, investigators noticed recurring features. Children tended to begin speaking about previous lives at very young ages. The memories were often spontaneous. Many cases involved violent or unexpected deaths. Some children displayed phobias apparently corresponding to the alleged manner of death. A child who supposedly drowned might develop an intense fear of water. A child who supposedly died in a fire might fear flames. A child who supposedly died in a vehicle accident might react strangely to cars. Some displayed unusual behaviors. Some had birthmarks. Some appeared to recognize people. Some identified places, and some seemed to possess knowledge they had apparently never been taught. Then, often, the memories disappeared. By later childhood, the person might remember little or nothing. This is one of the most intriguing features. Because if a child were deliberately inventing a story, why would the story disappear? Of course, psychology has explanations for childhood memory. Children's autobiographical memory changes dramatically as their brains develop. They forget enormous amounts of early childhood experience. So the disappearance of past life memories doesn't prove anything. But if you believe these cases represent genuine memories, the pattern makes intuitive sense. The memories emerge before the child's ordinary identity has completely solidified. Then they fade as the current personality becomes dominant. That raises a profound possibility. What if memory isn't entirely contained within the conscious identity we experience? And what if what we call I is less permanent than we think? There is another phenomenon worth mentioning: xenoglossy. The alleged ability to speak or respond in a language that the person did not normally learn. Ian Stevenson's research included cases involving what researchers called responsive xenoglossy, where the person allegedly demonstrated interactive ability in a language not learned through ordinary means. The University of Virginia Press describes his work as including detailed reports of such cases. This is an especially controversial area, and it should be. Language acquisition is extraordinarily complicated. Claims that someone suddenly speaks an unknown language deserve enormous scrutiny. But again, we're not trying to prove reincarnation tonight. We're trying to understand why researchers have continued investigating these cases for decades, because every time the subject seems finished, another strange case appears. So, what do we do with these stories? James Leininger, Ryan Hammons, the Pollock twins, Cameron Macaulay, Swarnlata Mishra, children separated from the people they supposedly remembered by years, sometimes decades, sometimes geography, and sometimes death itself. Are they proof of reincarnation? No, at least not scientifically. There is no universally accepted experiment demonstrating that a human personality dies, travels somewhere, and is installed inside another body. But here's the thing, that isn't the same as saying every strange case has been explained. Some have obvious weaknesses. Some rely heavily on family testimony. Some contain contradictory statements. Some may have been influenced by cultural expectations. Some almost certainly contain ordinary coincidences, and some are much harder to dismiss. Especially the cases where information was recorded before investigators knew who the deceased person might have been. Those cases don't tell us what happened. They simply make the mystery harder to close. And perhaps that's the most honest conclusion. We don't know, but consider what that means. We spend our entire lives constructing an identity. Our name, our childhood, our memories, our face, our relationships. We say, "This is me." But what if the thing we call me isn't the entire story? What if consciousness is stranger than we assume? What if memory isn't exclusively something the brain produces? What if these children aren't remembering another life at all, but somehow accessing information left behind by someone else? And if that's possible, what does that make consciousness? A signal, a field, a pattern? Something that can survive the destruction of the body? Or perhaps none of that? Perhaps the brain is simply capable of creating extraordinarily convincing narratives from fragments of information we don't realize we've absorbed. Perhaps these children are not remembering the dead. Perhaps they're constructing stories from the living. And maybe that's the most frightening possibility of all, because if that explanation is correct, then the human mind is capable of creating a reality so convincing that even investigators can struggle to tell where memory ends and imagination begins. But if the reincarnation hypothesis is correct, then death may not be the ending we think it is. It may simply be the moment the story changes narrators, and somewhere out there, perhaps right now, there may be another child having a nightmare. A child sitting upright in bed, confused, terrified, calling for a mother they've never had, describing a house they've never seen, remembering a name that belongs to someone who has been dead for decades, and perhaps the child will eventually forget, or perhaps someone will listen, someone will write it down, and years later, someone will go looking, and they'll find the house, the photograph, the family, the grave. And suddenly the impossible will have a name. The question is whether the name belongs to the child or to someone who died long before the child was born. This is Stranger Things. I am your host Macaulay, and until next time, keep looking where the story says there should be nothing there. Because sometimes, that's exactly where the strange things are waiting.